By the end of 1941, something fundamental had begun to shift inside Germany's highest military circles. Publicly, Hitler still appeared unchallenged, the victorious Führer who had crushed France, dominated continental Europe, and humiliated Britain on the battlefield. But behind closed doors, among the men who actually planned and fought Germany's wars, confidence was eroding fast. The reason was not ideology nor sudden moral awakening. It was competence. In December 1941, Germany stood at a crossroads created by Hitler himself. Operation Barbarossa, launched 6 months earlier as a lightning campaign to destroy the Soviet Union, had failed to deliver the decisive victory Hitler had promised. Instead of collapsing, the Red Army absorbed catastrophic losses and kept fighting. German troops, exhausted and undersupplied, stalled before Moscow as winter set in. For senior generals trained in traditional Prussian military thinking, this was more than a setback. It was proof that Hitler had misjudged the scale, resilience, and strategic depth of the Soviet Union. Even worse, he had ignored repeated warnings. Intelligence reports, logistical assessments, and operational objections had all been brushed aside in favor of Hitler's personal intuition. When the Wehrmacht failed to capture Moscow and was forced into defensive fighting for the first time, many commanders quietly concluded that Germany was now fighting a war it could no longer win on its own terms. The deeper fracture, however, lay not in defeat alone, but in Hitler's response to it. Rather than accepting responsibility or allowing professional soldiers to adapt strategy, Hitler tightened his grip on command. In December 1941, he dismissed Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch and appointed himself Commander-in-Chief of the Army. From that moment on, operational decisions increasingly flowed directly from Hitler's headquarters. He issued rigid, stand-fast orders, forbidding retreats even when encirclement was imminent. For generals raised on flexibility, maneuver warfare, and calculated withdrawals, this approach was militarily reckless. Entire formations were sacrificed to preserve symbolic ground rather than combat power. As casualties mounted, frustration spread through the officer corps. Hitler no longer behaved like a supreme commander coordinating strategy. He acted as an infallible authority who believed willpower alone could override geography, logistics, and weather. By early 1942, many generals still respected his political authority, but privately questioned his judgment as a war leader. They did not yet speak openly of overthrow or resistance. Instead, faith eroded quietly through tense briefings, ignored memoranda, and growing disbelief as Hitler continued to demand total obedience while rejecting any information that contradicted his expectations. The myth of Hitler as a military genius had not collapsed overnight, but by the winter of 1941 to 42, for a significant part of Germany's high command, it had begun to crack beyond repair. As 1942 unfolded, the gap between Germany's professional military leadership and Hitler's personal war direction widened into open tension behind closed doors. The generals were no longer debating isolated mistakes. They were confronting a structural problem. Hitler's decision-making had become increasingly centralized, emotional, and detached from battlefield realities. Operational conferences turned into monologues in which dissent was interpreted as disloyalty. Senior officers who raised concerns about overstretched supply lines, manpower shortages, or Soviet regeneration were dismissed as pessimists. Hitler's belief in his own intuition hardened into doctrine. He insisted that Germany's setbacks were not the result of flawed strategy, but of insufficient resolve by commanders in the field. This thinking led directly to a pattern that deeply alarmed the general staff. Instead of adjusting objectives to resources, Hitler escalated demands. The summer campaign of 1942 was conceived not as a consolidation after failure, but as a renewed gamble for decisive victory in the East. The focus shifted south toward the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad, despite clear warnings that Germany lacked the forces to sustain such an advance on multiple axes. For many generals, this plan confirmed their growing fear that Hitler no longer understood the relationship between operational ambition and logistical reality. The Wehrmacht was being asked to achieve more with less, while losses from the previous year had not been replaced. The situation deteriorated further once Hitler began intervening not just at the strategic level, but at the tactical one. Divisions and even regiments found themselves bound by orders issued hundreds of kilometers away, based on outdated maps and delayed reports. Commanders in the field were stripped of initiative, their authority reduced to executing rigid instructions regardless of circumstances. When Soviet counterattacks threatened encirclement, requests for withdrawal were routinely denied. Hitler's obsession with holding ground at all costs turned operational setbacks into catastrophes. Entire armies were immobilized, bled white, and destroyed rather than allowed to maneuver. This approach fundamentally violated German military tradition, which valued flexibility and preservation of combat strength. By late 1942, many senior officers no longer believed that errors could be corrected through professional advice or staff planning. Hitler had created an environment where honest assessment was punished and obedience rewarded, even when obedience led to disaster. The officer corps did not yet openly rebel, but loyalty was increasingly formal rather than sincere. Faith in Hitler as a war leader was replaced by resignation, fear, and quiet cynicism. Generals continued to salute and carry out orders, but internally many had reached a grim conclusion. The war was being driven by ideology and ego rather than strategy, and Germany's military leadership had been reduced to instruments of decisions they no longer trusted. The erosion of confidence that began in 1941 was now entrenched, and its consequences would soon become irreversible. The breaking point for many German generals came not from abstract disagreements, but from a series of undeniable catastrophes that exposed the full cost of Hitler's command style. Nowhere was this clearer than at Stalingrad. As the Sixth Army became increasingly encircled in late 1942, field commanders sent urgent reports warning that collapse was imminent. Supplies were insufficient, airlift capacity was inadequate, and Soviet forces were tightening the ring. Yet Hitler categorically forbade any breakout attempt. He rejected professional assessments and instead relied on assurances that the Luftwaffe could sustain the army by air and that relief forces would arrive in time. Senior officers knew these promises were unrealistic, but their objections carried no weight. When the Sixth Army was finally destroyed in early 1943, over 250,000 men were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. For the German officer corps, this was not merely a defeat. It was a self-inflicted disaster. Stalingrad shattered the last remnants of belief that Hitler's instincts could compensate for strategic reality. Even generals who had once admired his boldness now saw a leader incapable of admitting error, even when the survival of entire armies was at stake. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, the atmosphere within the high command changed fundamentally. Conversations that once revolved around how to win the war increasingly shifted toward how long Germany could continue fighting at all. Confidence in ultimate victory gave way to damage control. Hitler, however, responded to defeat not with reassessment, but with further radicalization. He intensified ideological control, expanded the role of political officers, and demanded absolute loyalty. Promotions and dismissals became tools of conformity rather than competence. Generals who attempted to preserve their forces through limited withdrawals were accused of defeatism. Others were removed outright. The chain of command eroded as fear replaced trust. By mid-1943, many senior officers understood that rational military planning had been subordinated to Hitler's personal worldview, where surrender, retreat, or compromise were unthinkable. The war had become existential in his mind, detached from material conditions. For the generals, this posed an impossible dilemma: obey orders they knew would lead to further destruction, or resist and risk immediate removal, or worse. Most chose silent compliance. A minority began to explore alternatives, not yet fully formed resistance, but the recognition that Hitler's leadership posed a greater danger to Germany than any external enemy. Faith had not merely declined, it had been replaced by a grim awareness that the war was now being steered toward catastrophe, and that those tasked with fighting it no longer controlled its course. By 1944, the loss of faith among German generals had hardened into something more dangerous than quiet doubt: acceptance that Hitler could no longer be reasoned with. Military conferences became increasingly detached from reality, dominated by ideological declarations rather than strategic evaluation. Hitler dismissed unfavorable reports as sabotage or defeatism, while surrounding himself with loyalists who reinforced his beliefs. The officer corps, once the backbone of German military professionalism, had been reduced to a mechanism for executing decisions it neither shaped nor trusted. Some generals attempted to mitigate damage at the margins, delaying orders or interpreting them as flexibly as possible, but the space for such maneuvering was shrinking fast. As Allied forces advanced from both west and east, Hitler's response remained unchanged: no retreat, no negotiation, no admission of error. The war, in his view, had become a test of will rather than capability. For many generals, this marked the final collapse of any remaining belief in Hitler as a commander. Victory was no longer a realistic objective. Survival of the army itself had become secondary to Hitler's ideological demands. Yet even at this stage, most officers did not act openly against him. The culture of obedience, reinforced by fear, loyalty oaths, and the memory of past purges, kept resistance limited and fragmented. Disillusionment did not automatically translate into defiance. A small number of officers, however, reached a different conclusion. They believed that Hitler's removal had become a military necessity. This conviction did not emerge from sudden moral clarity, but from years of watching professional advice ignored and armies destroyed for symbolic objectives. The failed assassination attempt of July 1944 was the most visible expression of this belief, but it represented only a fraction of the broader collapse of confidence within the high command. When the plot failed, the consequences were devastating. Executions, arrests, and purges swept through the officer corps, eliminating not only conspirators, but also anyone suspected of independent thinking. This repression further cemented the silence of those who remained. By the final months of the war, German generals continued to fight, not because they believed in Hitler's leadership, but because there was no longer an alternative within the system he controlled. Faith had given way to fatalism. Orders were followed mechanically, even as defeat became inevitable. The loss of confidence that began after 1941 thus reached its final form, not rebellion but paralysis. Hitler retained absolute authority until the end, but it was authority hollowed out by mistrust, fear, and the quiet understanding among his own commanders that the war had been lost long before it was allowed to end.